Realization and Return, Vuyk, Indonesian Women. There are relatively few women writers in early 20th century Southeast Asian literature. The Indonesian Raden Kartini, Vietnamese Ba Tun Long, and Malayan Ani Saburin are among the dozen of female authors from the region. In addition, there were also a handful of Dutch women who have written about Indonesia or the Dutch East Indies, as it was then known, through their plays and proses. These include Hella Haases, Maria de Moot, and of course Vuyk. Given that I'm presenting this paper to a group of scholars, most of whom are fairly acquainted with Southeast Asian history and literature, I will dive straight into the subject matter of my discussion. Vuyk was born in Rotterdam, in the Netherlands in 1905 to a Eurasian father and a Maduran mother. She traveled to Java in 1929 at a young age of 24 and remained in Indonesia until her repatriation in 1957. Over the long 28-year period, she experienced the late colonial regime under the Dutch administration, the Japanese occupation of Indonesia, as well as the country's independence. She and her family had made the conscious decision to adopt Indonesian citizenship, as well as fight for the reunification of the archipelago, going against the secession agenda of the South Moluccans, despite having lived in Maluku for 8 years. The 3 pieces of writings that I've selected range across genres and periods. The Last House in the World was published in 1939. This 100-page novel tells of her family's business in reproducing whitewood oil on the island of Buru. All Our Yesterdays is a short story written in 1958 about a woman's interrogation by the Japanese Kempeitai during the Second World War. The third piece is a commentary entitled A Weekend with Richard Wright. It was published in 1960 in a Dutch magazine, where Vuyk wrote about the African Americans' visit to Indonesia during the Bandung Conference and her responses to his report. The choice to analyze these 3 texts from a comparative perspective is that they have all been translated to English and is closely aligned with my current topic of this study, that is women in mid-20th century Indonesia. The 3 narratives are also set separately in Buru, Batavia, and Bogor, and thus provide readers with a glimpse of women in 3 different locales at various times. Academic research on Dutch East Indies literature of the 19th and 20th centuries often focus on 2 distinct aspects of the text. The first is the colonial and post-colonial experiences of the writers and their characters. Typical discussions hover around the power struggle, treatment, and discrimination of one group or the other. The other popular topic lies in the nostalgia for the colonial status quo, such as a moment of affection that is known in the Netherlands as Tempo Dulu, or Old Times. Derived from this couple of discourses are the genres of travel literature and memory writing, where the writer or protagonist narrates the movement and sentiment from one location to another, or the reminiscence of the past. E.M. Beekman, in his introduction to the English translation of Vuyk, The Last House in the World, discussed 3 interesting aspects within Dutch Indies literary discourse. He mentions Vuyck's use of colours, animals, and the gender of the traveller or adventurer. Taken together, these 3 thematic categories in themselves readily and subconsciously espouse a colonial gaze for a European to rediscover the tropical colours, tropical animals, and tropical division of gender via spatial means, that is, the domesticated women and the male farmers and hunters. Instead of such colonialist and essentialist reading, my aim in this presentation is to unearth the multiple positions of women visible in Vuyck's writings. The realization in the title of my paper thus refers to Vuyck's realization that there are other women besides her persona in the stories. While the narrators in Vuyck's work are often she herself, the other women who popped up in the narrative represent a categorical contrast in many different ways. The women seem to be caught up in various activities, while the storyteller herself appears frequently to be, well, telling the story. These women, however, have little to no agency throughout their participation within the contours of the plots. With or without them, the narrative arc of the storyline remains fairly intact and equally excitable. In the novel The Last House in the World, the narrator is the wife of a Dutch plantation owner on the island of Buru in the Moluccas. They work with a native co-owner of the business by the name of Haije, who manages their interactions with the village chief, recruitment of workers from around the region, and navigating a family sojourn to a neighboring island in the south called Ambelau. After an elaborate introduction of the men and their circumstances after the First World War, Vuyk shares with her readers about the spouses of Haije, the Dutch officials, as well as the Chinese shopkeepers. It is through these realizations that we learned about the activities of the women folks in Buru. Quote, Haije's wife helps with the washing and the cooking, but there is a lot to be done. Bread has to be baked, wood cut, charcoal burned, and the yard swept. Her full name is Angelina Barnes. She comes from a quadroon family of liberated slaves who took their master's name after they converted to Christianity. She has lived here for years, right next to the big house, but it doesn't show at all. She's just as lazy and dirty and yaks just as much as any other woman in the kampong. But she makes great bread and is very loyal and is tied to us for life. End quote. Through this passage, we realize an extensive amount of biographical information about the everyday life of a Moluccan woman on Buru Island. Her ancestors were the slaves of a certain Mr. Barnes, and Angelina is she herself an Eurasian of Christian faith. Yet, she performs all the duties for the author's family of four as well as her own. Angelina does both the tasks in the kitchen as well as the household chores. The last sentence of this paragraph is of significant interest as well. The comparisons with other women in the village shapes Angelina as an ordinary, down-to-earth person who does not display any air of arrogance just because she is associated with the Dutch colonial class. The use of but as a conjunction also reveals a fair and intimate appraisal of the division of labor in the house. This brief passage from within the 100-page novel from 1939 furnishes us present-day readers with information on the roles and social dealings of women in a small colonial plantation. Apart from people on Buru Island itself, the narrator's family also receives guests from the neighboring region of Siram. We realize that the exchange of gifts between the women by the men are in the form of food, namely sugar, salt, and coffee, and luxuries in the likes of soap and even a dog. Here is one of the rare instances in the diplomatic and literary history of Southeast Asia where we realize that women are equally invested in presenting gifts to one another via the proxy of their husbands. Instead of the common male-to-male or male-to-female sharing of objects and fluids in Southeast Asian culture, we learned here. Finally, there are two other groups of foreign, the Sulanis from Mongolia and the Chinese merchants. As cultural aliens, the women have to execute extra tasks such as foraging and watching over the fire, while the men take their siesta. The Chinese girls, on the other hand, are decked out in silk and tulle on their wedding day, feasting on shark's fins and bird's nests, fish guts and century eggs. When one of the Chinese mothers lost a son, all they had to do was return to China to purchase another one. Quote, "Children are cheap in China these days," end quote. Through this representation of extreme lifestyles between two foreign groups, we realize a disparate sense of inequality among women living on the little island of Buru. When the Japanese occupied Indonesia a few years later, Vuyk conveyed to her readers the defiance of a captured Dutch woman in her short story All Our Yesterdays from 1958. Like her counterparts in The Last House in the World, she is nameless and her identity is labeled as, quote, "the wife of the former mayor," end quote. As if to emphasize the racial similitude with the protagonist, the character is described as, quote, "having a white face framed by tangled reddish hair," end quote. From what we know about the woman, apart from the visitations by her niece and child, was that she sobbed and screamed. Ultimately, we witness once again the female-to-female bonding being delineated in the text, when she confided to the narrator that she had destroyed the evidence by taking apart the radio and throwing the pieces into the river, then supplementing that it was the very river that she would bring her little boy to every afternoon. This final nugget of information rekindles a possible comparison with the Chinese woman on Buru who lost and replaced her son, as well as the lieutenant's wife who accompanied her sick child from shore to shore in seek of a cure. The relationship between women and their children encapsulates a recurring trope in Vuyck's early writings. However, it is in a subsequent piece published by Vuyk that after she had been repatriated to the Netherlands, that we eventually for once get the opportunity to hear the voices of the children themselves. In the commentary A Weekend with Richard Wright, a group of Indonesians from a magazine firm were excited to meet with the African-American writer Richard Wright to talk about the decolonization agenda. Their meeting took place in Bogor in 1955 at the sidelines of the Bandung Conference. Beth Vuyk was herself present and wrote the two-part commentary to express her views on the discussions and aware of the impact she has on other people. She is nevertheless often hesitant and unsure of herself in company because she tends to be the victim of her husband's wrong-headed belief that every word an intelligent woman speaks must be as intelligent as she is. What's more, she has saddened herself with the tiring business of having to be the modern intellectual Indonesian woman whenever she's around people she doesn't know, especially around foreigners. With me, she gave it up long ago. She's pleasant, really intelligent despite her little affectations, and in certain situations, she is as helpless as a caged bird in a primeval forest. She comes from a very religious Minangkabau family, and during the turbulent years of the Japanese occupation, she was the clever little daughter her parents hid away in a strict Islamic boarding school. She came straight out of that school into the chaos of the revolution and married Roux just before the transfer of sovereignty. With her husband, she fell into the hands of institutions like the Dutch Foundation for Cultural Cooperation and the Rockefeller Foundation that charted them off all over the world. She saw and learned a great deal at that time, but she came out of it a bit breathless, especially when she found herself wedged in between what she used to be and what she is now. This was one of those occasions. She really wanted to come with me, but at the same time she put up a fight against going, unless it was all a little show of being a good wife and mother for her own mother, who could hear everything we said from the adjoining room. Surprisingly, the character is the wife of someone again, but she's no more lazy and dirty, but attractive and graceful. Yet she remains not only under the control of a man, but also the agenda of national development to be a modern intellectual Indonesian woman, as well as that of international institutes. In the final sentence, Vuyck's affectionate nanny was realized as having to decide between being docile or cosmopolitan. And the readers know instantly that she had chosen to put on her high heels in a metaphorical move to embrace the world again. The many activities and experiences of the Indonesian women in Vuyck's stories from the 1930s to 1950s have informed and enchanted many of us Anglophone readers. While this remains a work in progress, I want to advance the argument that the realization and return of Vuyck's works and women are not just possible via Dutch literature or colonial literature. Vuyck's creative output can also be reframed as important contributions to the lineage of canonic Southeast Asian and Indonesian literature, albeit in the Dutch language.